got a few news stories to get into that have just come out today. Now, the first one is about a subject that I did a show on at the beginning of the year. Back in mid-January, this was a big story that broke about the infiltrators into the environmental movement. You might remember this character called Mark Kennedy, who was an undercover cop, and he'd basically infiltrated an environmental movement. He'd been living and working with them for a number of years. You might remember the guy. He kind of bore an uncanny resemblance to Kid Rock, quite weirdly. Long hair and shades and a hat is the photograph that I'm looking at right now, and a goatee beard. But his actual undercover name was Mark Stone. His real name was Mark Kennedy. And yeah, he was running undercover with these environmental protesters for a number of years, and he was really key to the whole thing. I mean, he was the guy with the transport, so he was basically driving people all over the place. He was, organising protests and actions, and some pretty heavy stuff as well. Even judges suggested that he was acting as an agent provocateur, which it does indeed seem he was. Here's a story from the 14th of January. Mark Kennedy took part in attack on Irish police officers at EU summit. Undercover police officer was involved in violent protest and helped train other demonstrators, anarchists claim. So there was basically an EU summit in Dublin. I think this was back in 2004. Yeah, it was on May Day 2004, and Mark Stone, real name Mark Kennedy, was there, right on the front lines, amongst the protesters who had to be held back by water cannon. So he was, actively provocateuring violence against the police. One of the anarchists who was involved in that action basically said he previously had no idea that Mark Kennedy was an undercover cop. He'd had no inklings at all that he was an undercover cop, but he suddenly became rather suspicious when he saw Kennedy suddenly remove his balaclava and approach the police lines at this demonstration, which of course he could do because he was working for the cops. He wasn't actually uncovered, Mark Kennedy, until a planned action to take over a power station. This was at the end of 2009, and there were a large number of environmental protesters camped out in a school, I believe, next to a power station. And Kennedy was amongst the protesters. By all accounts, he was whispering into his highly expensive watch, which was actually a transmitter transmitting what he was saying into it back to his colleagues. Anyway, some of his fellow protesters, I think, found some ID which basically showed that he wasn't who he said he was, and he was rumbled that way. And anyway, the story that's come out today is about the various women who have been duped by not only Mark Kennedy but also several other undercover protesters, because there was a number of them have been uncovered. I think it's 7 in total so far, and those are just the ones that have been uncovered. Obviously there's likely to be a load more that we simply don't know about, but a group of 8 women are basically taking legal action and claiming that they suffered from emotional trauma after being effectively duped into forming relationships with these people who were working undercover. I mean, you can understand this, can't you? If you had been in a long-term relationship, I believe one of them was seeing a guy for like years and years. If you'd been in a relationship like that, and then you suddenly found out the person that you'd been in a relationship with, obviously sleeping with, had been completely lying to you, wasn't what you thought they were, wasn't a protester, but was actually an undercover cop, well, that's going to mess you up, isn't it? That's definitely going to mess you up a bit. And I mean, some of these guys even had like wives and children. They were living complete double lives. Wives and children back home, and then they were going to work with a different name and conducting sexual relationships with other women. I think one of them is even alleged to have had children with one of the activists that they were in a relationship with. And you know, there's all kinds of very serious questions here about well, I mean, first of all, the fact that the police are using these undercover cops to infiltrate these movements is bad enough, but I mean, it's just to be expected, isn't it? We all know about the agents provocateurs, the undercover cops. That's kind of common knowledge now, really. But the fact that these undercover cops were even using emotional manipulation and sexual manipulation to get information, to get intelligence on activists is fairly, you know, as disgraceful is the only word you can use for it, really. I mean, you know, the high up police chiefs who were running this operation have naturally denied all knowledge of these relationships, but Mark Kennedy himself said that his superiors knew full well what he was up to, and that he was using sex as a tool to gather intelligence on his targets. So, you know, fair play to these women, and I hope that they do manage to get some justice for what they've been through, because it must cause emotional trauma, as they're claiming. Absolutely. Of course, there's the whole other aspect of the cost of these operations, these undercover operations, which were often in, you know, fairly harmless movements, such as this movement, this environmental movement. They were actually climate change activists. I mean, whatever you might think about climate change and global warming and things like that, I think you'd probably agree that these aren't terrorists. They might have been planning to occupy a power station, but you know, it's hardly really serious disorder and terrorism, is it? And this, you know, to run these undercover cops must have cost a lot of money. And who pays for these operations? Well, of course, it's the taxpayers, as always, which is going to be a running theme of tonight's show. The fact that we are paying for our own enslavement, basically. This is just one example that our tax money goes to pay for undercover spies who are spying on well-meaning people who have a cause and simply want to make things better. We're paying for that. Not the only thing we're paying for, of course, with our taxes. Paying for war. Another story in the news this week, of course, has been the supposed end of military operations in Iraq. Even though, of course, it's not going to be the end of operations in Iraq. I mean, you know, that country has been taken over now, and the US might symbolically be withdrawing troops from Iraq, but that country, you know, has been totally infiltrated now by the people who are trying to implement this new world order, the Anglo-American Israeli alliance. You know, and I've talked in previous shows about Iraq, you know, no need to go over that again. It's absolutely horrendous what's happened in Iraq. I've talked before about how really it was Iraq that woke me up, you know, the cliche, you have to wake up. Well, it was really Iraq that woke me up, and the build up to Iraq, when I could see very clearly, even though I wasn't particularly political at the time. That's what politicized me, because I could see the lies so clearly and the injustice so clearly, you know. Could see back then that this was going to be one of the crimes of the century, which indeed it was, you know. Let me just pull up some statistics about the Iraq war. Fairly depressing, but I think we do need to remind ourselves of the facts and figures. I mean, these are the official facts and figures, so no doubt these are, you know, way underestimated. Just pulling up this story now. Well, US casualties, 4,484 military personnel since the outbreak of war. Have to say though, you know, in terms of the loss of life in Iraq, I don't want to sound heartless, but you know, my sympathies lie with the innocent people who've been killed in that country, the innocent men, women and children of Iraq who've been murdered during this illegal invasion and takeover. You know, I don't cheer about the deaths of military personnel, but as I've said before, they chose to go there, so, you know, free will and all that. You know, I could understand the soldiers who went to Afghanistan in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. These patriotic young men and women, often not very well educated, especially about current affairs, about geopolitics. They wanted to get revenge for Osama bin Laden crashing these planes into the Twin Towers, which of course we all know is a total lie. But in terms of Iraq, you know, it was very obvious what was happening in Iraq, and especially so after a number of years. You know, anyone who went to Iraq several years into that occupation, well, the information was readily available on the internet to show how this war was totally illegal, totally immoral, and was, yeah, outright criminal. So these troops who chose to go to Iraq, you know, that's the risk they ran of being blown up and killed. So, yeah, in terms of Iraqi casualties, let's have a look at the figures for Iraqi casualties in this war. Well, this is pretty low according to the official statistic. Well, this is from Iraq body count, but I feel quite sure that it must be more than this. Iraq body count reckons 113,728 Iraqis have died. So that sounds pretty, you know, pretty small to me. I've read figures, as I'm sure you have, that have been much higher than just over 100,000. You know, but that's bad enough. You know, 100,000 is it's absolutely shocking. In terms of the financial cost, let's have a look. Over $800 billion US dollars. So that's heading for $1 trillion basically, and I'm sure that's vastly underestimated, you know. So at a time when the Western economies are basically collapsing, people are living in abject poverty, the US is still able to spend nearly $1 trillion on the war in Iraq. You know, absolutely disgusting, really, isn't it? Taxpayers' money as well. So we're paying for spies to spy on us, and we're paying for wars of aggression which murder and enslave the people of other countries, people just like us. You know, these people in Iraq, they're just like me and you. They just want to live a normal life. They want to work, they want to look after their families, they want to have a decent standard of living. They didn't ask for Britain and America to invade their country, to get rid of a dictator who, of course, was brutal, but who'd previously been a friend of the invading forces, who'd been an ally. We've all seen the infamous footage of Donald Rumsfeld shaking Saddam Hussein's hand, you know, in the 80s, when the West actually backed Iraq against Iran. Which kind of leads me on to the next story about Iran. I talked in last week's show about how many people think that Iran was basically trying to develop nuclear weapons to counter the threat from Iraq. The West had been supporting Iraq during the Iran-Iraq conflict in the 80s, and Iran believed that Saddam Hussein was trying to develop nuclear weapons, so therefore Iran felt they had to also develop nuclear weapons. And this program's believed to have gone on for a number of years, but credible sources, according to Seymour Hersh, who you heard from in my last show, believe that this nuclear program actually stopped in 2003 when the West invaded Iraq, and obviously no weapons of mass destruction were found, so it's believed that Iran then stopped their nuclear program. And in last week's show I went into depth about the propaganda against Iran, you know, and I can't help but talk about that again, really, because it's so important. You know, it's key to all of this. Everything seems to be building up towards an attack and an attempted takeover of Iran. In last week's show I talked about the Arab Spring. We see this creeping takeover by the West of North African and Middle Eastern countries. I mean, most overtly Libya, of course, and now we see Syria, which, you know, it's hard to get evidence for, but you might have seen James Corbett's report from yesterday or the day before, where he talks about NATO troops being amassed near the border, the Syrian border. You know, no doubt, there's no doubt the West is heavily involved in this destabilization of Syria. And I mentioned last week about Webster Tarpley, who claims that this, you know, this is being completely overblown and manipulated by the Western media, that most of the people in Syria are actually supportive of Assad. You know, that might be the case, I don't know. I do question why Tarpley was allowed to just wander around Syria, and why he didn't film any of these people he talked to. But, you know, take his information for what it is. Quite possible. But, you know, you just look at Iran on the map and see this ring around the country of the Anglo-Americans, and it's quite clear that that's the main target. And we do need to keep shouting about the fact that there is this propaganda being pushed by the West against Iran, and it's completely unjustified. There is literally no evidence that Iran are trying to develop nuclear weapons. We do need to keep stressing this fact, because it's becoming an accepted it's becoming accepted in the mainstream media and amongst the populace. I mean, if you speak to someone on the street who maybe watches the mainstream news, doesn't look at any alternative media, and you ask them about Iran, I haven't, you know, done a survey or anything, but my guess would be that most people would believe that Iran was actively trying to develop nuclear weapons, when there simply isn't the evidence to show that they are. And as I've also stressed in previous shows, they've continuously said that they're developing nuclear energy for peaceful energy production purposes, which is quite within their rights as signatories to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which of course Israel refuses to sign because they have a policy of deliberate ambiguity as regarding their nuclear arsenal, which is believed to run to hundreds of nuclear weapons. And Israel are on record as stating that they will massively attack a country with nuclear weapons if they feel threatened. The Samson option. As I mentioned last week, Seymour Hersh, who has written the book The Samson Option, which I haven't actually read yet, but I really should get into reading that. I've read summaries and articles based on it, but I haven't actually read the book, but I plan to. But Israel are on record as stating that they will attack anyone that they think is a threat. They want to be the mad dog of the Middle East who no one dares to threaten. So as I've said in previous shows, even if Iran were developing nuclear weapons, who the hell can blame them when they're surrounded on all sides by Western-backed regimes? Iraq, Syria now is looking like it's heading that way. Afghanistan, of course, the stands to the north of Iran, which the West pretty much controls, puppet client regimes. But most specifically Israel, and the threat posed by Israel. Why wouldn't Iran want nuclear weapons? It would be some small deterrent against this massive nuclear arsenal that Israel holds. I was going to say is believed to hold, but I mean, even though they don't admit having nuclear weapons, it's pretty much beyond doubt that they do, and they have loads of them, and they're quite prepared to use them. So anyway, the story that I was going to mention, which just came out today, was about Russia apparently seizing a radioactive consignment bound for Iran. This is a story which just came out this afternoon. Apparently someone was stopped trying to board a plane to Tehran from a Moscow airport, and they were carrying a consignment of the radioactive isotope sodium-22, just like this passenger carrying on in a passenger's bag. They apparently had 18 metallic objects of industrial origin packed into individual steel boxes. Obviously the airport security in Russia must be slightly less strict than it is in the West, because I can't imagine anyone even attempting to get on a plane with a bag stuffed full of metal parts. It's just crazy. I mean, it was intercepted, so maybe they have got strict airport security, but who knows. And anyway, no details were immediately available on the consignment or the identity of the passenger who was carrying the materials. The state RIA Novosti news agency, citing an unidentified representative of Russian state nuclear agency Rosatom, said sodium-22 was produced in so-called cyclotrons, a type of particle accelerator, and not in nuclear reactors. Cyclotrons are used in medical and educational establishments in Russia, as well as institutes of the Russian Academy of Sciences. I mean, I'm not too up on my nuclear physics, but I mean, my initial sort of reaction to this was, there's no doubt going to be a false flag carried out in terms of demonizing Iran. So could this be the first false flag being carried out by the West to demonize Iran and Iran's nuclear program? Because it would be very easy to send somebody into an airport to be intercepted carrying this bag of radioactive material. And could this be part of the build-up, the propaganda against Iran? No doubt. I think if we're going to see a big false flag coming up in the near future, then common sense says that it's going to be something to do with Iran. I think Al Qaeda has really been kind of put on the back burner now. I think the myth of Al Qaeda has kind of run its course. We haven't seen any major terrorist attacks since 7/7 in London, and like this year especially has been the year of the supposed killing of senior Al Qaeda members. the supposed killing of Bin Laden, of course. We had Ayman al-Awlaki taken out, and it's all been pretty quiet on the Al Qaeda front. People are starting to, I think, wake up to the fact that this supposed worldwide Islamic terrorist network with tentacles everywhere and a cell in every city is an overblown myth. Maybe that's run its course now, and the powers that be, as they are very clearly trying to push for an attack on Iran, common sense says that there's going to have to be some kind of false flag based on based on Iran, basically. I think we're all very much aware of the fact that a big false flag is quite likely. Don't want to fall into the Alex Jones kind of fear-mongering mentality. That's not what I'm trying to do at all, but it's really a danger, isn't it? A big false flag attack. And as some of us were talking about the other night in the Resistance Radio Pal Talk room, we've got the London Olympics coming up, of course, next year, and you've got to be worried about that event, especially with the other big news story that's come out this week about the absolutely insane numbers of troops that are going to be used during the Olympics next year. Let me just get the statistics up for that, because it really is quite insane the number of troops that are going to be on the streets during the London Olympics. 13,500 troops are going to be used during the Olympics, and that's greater than the British deployment in Afghanistan, which ran to 9,500. I mean, some just absurd statistics about the number of military who are going to be used during the Olympics. 13,500 military personnel, including 7,500 to boost the number of security staff inside Olympic venues. The Royal Navy's largest ship, the 22,500 ton helicopter carrier HMS Ocean, is going to be based in Greenwich for the duration of the games, and the assault vessel HMS Bullock will be moored in Weymouth, where the sailing events take place. It's just nuts. An appropriate and scalable air security plan includes Typhoon aircraft at RAF Northolt, helicopters operating from HMS Ocean, and appropriate surface-to-air missile systems. 12,000 police officers also on the streets on the busiest day of the games. So yeah, just nuts. And of course, I mean, why are these troops and these police being used on such a massive scale? Is it really because we face a threat from Al Qaeda or Iran? Well, no, of course not. I mean, of course there's always the threat of a false flag, as I mentioned before. If there is an attack, it's highly likely that Western intelligence are going to be in some way behind that attack. So is there really a credible threat of an attack from terrorists who are going to take the Western intelligence services completely off guard, just like they managed to do on 9/11 so miraculously? No, I don't think so. But of course, what this is all about is getting people used to seeing the use of military on the streets, you know, because that's what we're heading into. This new world order that we're heading into is a system where the military are going to be used for, you know, civilian duties. We've already had talk of the military on the streets during the recent riots. Even Nigel Farage was a big supporter of troops on the streets. You know, I know some people are fans of Nigel Farage, including hosts on Resistance Radio, which is something of a puzzle to me because, you know, the guy is a monarchist and he called for the military on the streets during the riots, which is nothing that I want any part of. So you know, I'm not a supporter of Nigel Farage or the Independence Party. You know, I'm pretty much done with politics. But anyway, yeah, this is just a foretaste of what's to come, a foretaste of the surveillance state, the security state. I had another glance over a report that I did a show on again earlier in the year, which I would encourage you to download and check out. That's a report called Neocon Opticon. This was a report written by a guy from an organisation called State Watch. State Watch, as you can tell by the name, an organisation which monitors infringement of civil liberties, and this report is all about the quite terrifying security industrial complex that is being put into place right now across the EU. Basically, again, we are paying for our enslavement because the military industrial complex, these massive defense companies, these massive security companies, are being paid by the EU to research new surveillance techniques, new security systems, really high-tech monitoring, tracking systems, things like that. So we're paying for this out of our taxes. We are quite literally paying for our own enslavement. And of course, you know, as it goes, the very people who are being paid to research these things are the people who are making profits from their implementation. So, as always, you know, a massive fundamental conflict of interest there. You know, it's in these companies' interests to hype up the threat from terrorists so they can sell their products, so they can get more state money to fund their research. You know, this is the thing. I mean, this literal 1984 that is coming into place, it's just a complete myth that we are, you know, in danger from terrorists. This is all about the elite, the political and the financial elite, simply trying to consolidate power, because that's what power does. These people have got power, but they want more power. You know, and it's not just private individuals who work for defense companies, it's the politicians as well. This is in their interests, you know. The pretense is that it's to protect the people from the terrorists, but the reality is, you know, the biggest threat to the people in power are the citizens of a country, me and you, and all of the other people who are basically having their standards of living lowered day by day. You know, the people are the biggest threat to these governments that we have, these totally corrupt governments who are working, you know, hand in hand with the banks, with these defense corporations. It's just a big money-making scam, and yeah, we are the victims of it. We're paying for our own enslavement to line the pockets of our politicians of these private security companies. I mean, it's a genius plan, isn't it, really, when you think about it? It's sick, but it's kind of genius in its own twisted way. You know, we see this with the banks as well. The banks have basically stolen a load of money, and then our governments have paid them for the money that has been lost by taking it from the citizens. It's just crazy. I mean, you know, and yet, you know, the government talks down the Occupy protest. I mean, the government should be pleased that that's all they're having to deal with at the moment, the Occupy protest in London. When you consider what's actually gone on over the last few years, you know, it's just outright fraud. It's outright theft. The people are being made to pay for it, and yet when there's a few people camped out in some tents, you know, they're being called terrorists. They're being included in lists with Al Qaeda and things like this. You know, because I mean, that's pretty tame, isn't it? It's a start, but it's pretty tame, really. Because we need more than this, really. I mean, this is what it comes down to, you know. I come onto this show every week and I talk about things, and you know, we can talk about this information as much as we want, but well, you know, we need to find some solutions. You know, what can we do about this? And I don't know what the answer is. I mean, I guess that's why I'm talking right now, because that's pretty much all we can do, isn't it? You know, talk about these things, and yeah, get out onto the streets if possible. You know, what other options are there? But you know, I do have hope that, as I said last week, this is the start of something. You know, the Occupy movement isn't perfect, you know. There are people who make up the Occupy movement who, you know, I don't particularly support. We've seen someone on YouTube this week who has been acting quite unreasonably, making a sort of dramatic video about agents provocateurs in the Occupy movement, which I've no doubt there are, but this individual was pointing the finger at completely the wrong person. They were basically pointing the finger at some ex-conservative party member who had set up an organisation basically opposed to the current system of taxation, you know, opposed to what I've just talked about, this crony capitalist system. And this Occupy London protester was basically accusing them of being an infiltrator, when it was obvious that they weren't. You know, they wanted to see this system changed, but they didn't want to see it changed in the way that this protester wanted it to be changed, who I assume was some kind of, you know, communist or something like that, which, you know, I'm not a communist. I don't think there's anything wrong with people making money, and this is coming from someone who's not rich. I don't have a great deal of money. I don't think I'm ever going to have a great deal of money, to be quite honest, but I'm not opposed to people having wealth, you know, if they deserve that wealth. I am attracted to the ideas of the free market anarchists, free market capitalists, like Stefan Molyneux, for example, and of course, you know, others who came before him. Would it work? You know, I have no idea. I'm not particularly attached to any one doctrine. I mean, it's quite confusing, really, you know. I think what we're all agreed on, though, is that this system needs to be radically changed, and targeting the banksters, you know, targeting the central banks is definitely a good start in all of that. Talking about the banks brings me on to another story from today, which only serves to confirm what we've all been saying for some time, and that's the fact that we are heading into a depression. If we aren't already technically a depression, then we're definitely going to be in one very soon. IMF warns that world risks sliding into a 1930s-style slump. Christine Lagarde calls for global unity to tackle financial crisis as French launch verbal broadsides at David Cameron and UK. So, the head of the IMF basically warning of the risk of the world sliding into another Great Depression. And if anyone's going to know about that, then it's going to be the IMF, isn't it? Because they're really the head of the snake, or one of the heads of the Hydra, They're responsible for the austerity measures that we're seeing around the world, especially in Europe, in Greece, in Britain. They're responsible for lending out this fictional money to countries, demanding that money back with interest, and when the governments can't afford to make those repayments, then the money has to come from us, the taxpayer, and it has to come from funds that previously went to social services. Whatever you might think about socialism, I'm sure you'd rather see money being spent on hospitals and welfare than going to line the pockets of these IMF financial terrorists. Effectively is what they are, isn't it?